Margaret Maggie Chen stepped out of the dusty pickup truck and surveyed the sprawling firearms training facility before her. The Arizona desert sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete buildings and outdoor ranges, creating waves of heat that made everything shimmer like a mirage. At 58 years old, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy over decades of military service, but her dark eyes remained sharp and alert. The Precision Shooting Academy was renowned throughout the Southwest as the premier destination for law enforcement training and competitive shooting events. Today, it would host the annual Interagency Marksmanship Championship, drawing the finest shooters from police departments, federal agencies, and military units across the region. Maggie had driven 6 hours from her small ranch in New Mexico to be here, carrying credentials that most people would find impressive if they bothered to look. She pulled her worn leather rifle case from the truck bed, noting how the younger men gathering near the main building glanced her way with barely concealed amusement. Their eyes took in her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her weathered hands, and the way she moved with deliberate care rather than youthful urgency. She could practically hear their thoughts. What was some old lady doing at a serious shooting competition? "Ma'am, I think you might be lost," called out a voice from the group. The speaker was a tall man in his 30s wearing a crisp polo shirt emblazoned with Metro PD SWAT across the chest. His perfectly styled hair and confident smile suggested someone used to being the center of attention. "The Senior Citizens Bowling League meets at the community center downtown." His companions erupted in laughter, slapping him on the back as if he had delivered the wittiest joke of the century. Maggie simply nodded politely and continued toward the registration building, her rifle case balanced easily in one hand despite its considerable weight. Inside the air-conditioned lobby, she approached the check-in desk where a young woman with a clipboard and headset was busy coordinating the day's events. The woman looked up with professional courtesy, but Maggie caught the slight double-take as she processed the unexpected appearance of this older female competitor. "Name and agency, please," the clerk asked, fingers poised over her tablet. "Margaret Chen, United States Army, retired," Maggie replied calmly, producing her identification and competition registration forms. The clerk's eyes widened as she scanned the paperwork. "Oh, wow! Sergeant Major Chen? I've heard about you. You're actually here to compete?" Maggie smiled patiently. She was accustomed to this reaction. "That's correct. I believe I'm registered for the Precision Rifle Division." "Yes, absolutely. You're all set up." The clerk's demeanor shifted to one of nervous respect. "Your shooting position is range 7, and the equipment inspection begins in 30 minutes. If you need anything at all, please let me know." As Maggie walked toward the preparation area, she passed a group of federal agents reviewing their gear. One of them, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, looked up from cleaning her rifle scope. "Excuse me?" the agent called out. "Are you Margaret Chen? The Margaret Chen who set the record at Camp Perry?" "I am," Maggie confirmed, stopping beside their table. "Agent Sarah Rodriguez, FBI Hostage Rescue Team." The woman introduced herself, extending a hand. "I read about your service record during our training courses. Weren't you the sniper instructor at Fort Benning for 15 years? 12 years as an instructor, 3 years developing the advanced marksmanship curriculum," Maggie corrected gently. "But that was a long time ago." "Not that long," Rodriguez insisted. "Those techniques you developed are still being taught today. My partner here, Agent Mills, graduated from your program in 2018. The younger agent looked up from his rifle maintenance with interest. "Wait, you're the Chen who wrote the manual on extreme long-range shooting? The one they call the Sniper's Bible?" Before Maggie could respond, a loud voice interrupted the conversation. "Ancient history!" The Metro SWAT officer from outside had entered the preparation area, flanked by several companions. We're talking about what matters today, not war stories from the last century. Rodriguez frowned. Officer, what's your name? Detective Jake Morrison, Metro SWAT, he replied with exaggerated pride. 3-time state champion, holder of multiple accuracy records, and I didn't need 40 years to get good at it. Actually, Maggie said quietly, I enlisted when I was 18. My first deployment was to Afghanistan in 1992. I retired last year after 37 years of active service. Morrison laughed. See? Ancient. Look, lady, no disrespect, but shooting was different back in your day. We've got better equipment now, better training, better everything. This isn't about what you did when dinosaurs walked the earth. This is about who can perform today right now under pressure. Several other competitors had gathered around, drawn by the increasingly tense exchange. Maggie noticed that most of them appeared to be siding with Morrison, nodding along with his dismissive comments about older shooters being past their prime. Morrison's right, added another SWAT officer. I've seen plenty of old-timers who think their war stories mean something on a modern range. Technology moves fast, and so does tactical shooting. What worked 20 years ago doesn't cut it anymore. Maggie remained silent, but Agent Rodriguez wasn't finished. Actually, Sergeant Major Chen was developing advanced techniques last year. She wasn't sitting around telling war stories. She was still training our best shooters right up until her retirement. Training is one thing, Morrison scoffed. Doing is another. I bet half these older competitors can't even see the targets clearly anymore, let alone hit them. No offense, ma'am, but maybe you should consider the senior division next time. There is no senior division, Mills pointed out. This is an open competition. Morrison shrugged. Maybe there should be. Level playing field and all that. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the facility's public address system. All competitors, please report to your assigned ranges for equipment inspection and preliminary sighting. The competition will begin in 15 minutes. As the group dispersed, Morrison made one final comment that carried clearly across the preparation area. Should be interesting to see how long the Ancient Mariner lasts against real shooters. Maggie gathered her equipment and walked calmly toward Range 7, ignoring the snickers that followed in her wake. She had endured far worse than juvenile insults during her military career, and she understood that many people equated age with inability. In her experience, those assumptions often proved costly for those who made them. Range 7 was positioned at the far end of the facility, with targets set at distances ranging from 100 to 1,000 yards. The competition would test precision, speed, and adaptability under various conditions, including wind, changing light, and time pressure. Each shooter would be evaluated on multiple scenarios designed to simulate real-world law enforcement and military situations. Maggie unpacked her rifle with practiced efficiency. The weapon was a custom-built precision rifle chambered in .308 Winchester, its barrel and action meticulously crafted by one of the finest gunsmiths in the country. Every component had been selected and tuned specifically for her shooting style and physical characteristics, the result of decades of refinement and adjustment. The rifle inspector, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and the bearing of someone who truly understood firearms, examined her weapon with obvious appreciation. "This is beautiful work," he commented, running his fingers along the precisely bedded action. "Who built this for you?" "I built it myself," Maggie replied, beginning to mount her scope with careful attention to torque specifications. The inspector's eyebrows rose. "Seriously? The barrel work, the trigger job, everything?" "Everything except the initial barrel forging. I have a workshop at home where I do gunsmithing as a hobby." "Hobby," the inspector muttered, shaking his head. "Ma'am, this is professional-grade work. Better than professional. This rifle probably shoots better than anything else on this range today." "It shoots well," Maggie agreed modestly. "But equipment is only part of the equation." As she completed her preparations, she could hear Morrison and his friends at the neighboring range, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air. "Look at that antique rifle," one of them said. "Probably uses iron sights. Even if it's scoped, her eyes can't be good enough for precision shooting at her age. I'm betting she can't even see the 500-yard targets clearly." "Should have brought binoculars," another added, prompting fresh laughter. Maggie adjusted her shooting mat and began checking her scope's 0 at the 100-yard line. Her first shot struck the target precisely in the center, followed by 4 more shots that created a group smaller than a quarter. The electronic scoring system registered perfect 10s across the board. The range officer, monitoring all competitors' performance on his tablet, paused and double-checked his screen. "Range 7, that's a .2-inch group at 100 yards. Outstanding shooting." Morrison glanced over from his own range, where his group measured nearly twice as large. "Lucky shots," he muttered, but his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. As the competition progressed through the preliminary rounds, Maggie's performance remained consistently excellent. Her 300-yard group measured under an inch, and her 500-yard shots clustered tightly around the 10 ring, despite gusty crosswinds that challenged every competitor. "Range 7 is looking very strong," the range officer announced during a break between stages. "All shots in the scoring zones, with several perfect scores." The comment drew attention from other competitors, many of whom wandered over to observe Maggie's next series of shots. She ignored the audience and focused on her fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, and follow-through. Her next target was set at 600 yards, a distance that would challenge even experienced shooters. The wind had picked up, requiring careful observation and compensation. Maggie spent several minutes watching the mirage through her scope and noting the movement of grass and dust at various points downrange. "She's taking forever," Morrison complained loudly. "This isn't a meditation session." "She's reading the wind," Rodriguez explained patiently. "That's what professionals do." "Professionals work fast," Morrison countered. "In the real world, you don't get 5 minutes to contemplate your belly button before taking a shot." Maggie finally settled behind her rifle, adjusting her position slightly to account for the changing wind conditions. She controlled her breathing, allowing her heart rate to settle into a steady rhythm. Her finger found the trigger and applied gradual pressure, increasing steadily until the rifle fired almost as a surprise. The bullet struck the target dead center, earning another perfect score. 4 more shots followed in rapid succession, each one placed with surgical precision despite the challenging conditions. The range fell silent for a moment, then erupted in murmurs of appreciation. Even Morrison's companions seemed impressed, though they tried to hide their reactions. "Good shooting," called out one of the federal agents. "That wind was tricky." "Thank you," Maggie replied simply, beginning to prepare for the next stage. Morrison walked over to her shooting position, his earlier swagger replaced by a more serious demeanor. "Okay, that was decent shooting," he admitted grudgingly, "but we're not done yet. The real test comes at long range under pressure." "I understand," Maggie said, cleaning her rifle barrel between stages as she had done thousands of times before. "The final stage is at 1,000 yards, Morrison continued. "That's where the men are separated from the boys, or in this case, where the young guns show what they can really do." Several competitors had gathered around to listen to this exchange, creating an audience for what was clearly becoming a personal challenge. Maggie noticed that the facility's staff had also taken interest, with several instructors and range officers positioning themselves to observe the final stage. The 1,000-yard targets represented the ultimate test of precision shooting. At that distance, even a perfectly fired bullet would drop over 100 inches compared to the rifle's bore line, requiring precise range estimation and ballistic calculation. Wind effects were magnified dramatically, and the smallest error in technique would result in a complete miss. You know, Morrison said, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. Maybe we should make this interesting. A little side competition between the old school and the new generation. What did you have in mind? Rodriguez asked, though her tone suggested she already knew where this was heading. Simple, head-to-head shooting at 1,000 yards. 5 shots each, best total score wins. Loser admits publicly that their approach to shooting is outdated. The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Every eye was on Maggie, waiting for her response to this obvious attempt to humiliate her in front of the entire competition. Maggie looked up from her rifle maintenance, her expression calm and unreadable. Detective Morrison, are you formally challenging me to a shooting match? That's exactly what I'm doing, Granny, Morrison replied, his confidence fully restored. Unless you're worried about embarrassing yourself in front of all these people. Agent Rodriguez started to intervene. Morrison, that's completely unnecessary. It's all right, Maggie interrupted gently. I accept Detective Morrison's challenge. She stood and extended her hand toward him. May the best shooter win. Morrison shook her hand with a grip designed to intimidate, but Maggie's own handshake was firm and steady. Around them, the crowd began buzzing with excitement as word of the challenge spread throughout the facility. Word of the challenge between Maggie Chen and Detective Morrison spread through the facility like wildfire. Competitors who had finished their events gathered around Range 7, and even the facility's administrative staff emerged from their offices to witness what was being called the match of the day. The air hummed with excited conversations as people placed informal bets and debated the likely outcome. Morrison basked in the attention, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his competitive achievements and predictions of easy victory. This is going to be educational, he announced to his growing circle of admirers. Sometimes experience has to step aside for excellence. Meanwhile, Maggie methodically prepared her equipment, seemingly oblivious to the circus atmosphere developing around her. She checked her rifle's scope settings, verified her ammunition selections, and began calculating the precise ballistic data needed for the 1,000-yard shot. Agent Rodriguez approached her shooting position quietly. Maggie, you don't have to do this. Morrison's being a complete ass, but proving yourself isn't worth putting up with his garbage. Maggie looked up from her ballistic calculator, a small electronic device that appeared almost ancient compared to the smartphones most competitors used for similar calculations. Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but I've been dealing with men like Detective Morrison my entire career. Sometimes the only language they understand is demonstrated competence. But what if, Rodriguez started to say, then stopped herself. I'm sorry. That was stupid. I just watched you shoot a quarter-inch group at 100 yards in this wind. Doubt is natural, Maggie replied with understanding. But confidence comes from preparation, not hope. She returned to her calculations, factoring in the current wind speed and direction, the temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. The 1,000-yard shot would require her bullet to travel for nearly 2 seconds, during which time gravity, wind, and atmospheric conditions would all conspire to push it off course. Success demanded precise mathematical calculation combined with intuitive understanding of ballistics that could only come from decades of experience. Dr. James Thompson, the facility's lead instructor and a former Marine Corps sniper, wandered over to observe her preparations. He was one of the few people present who truly understood what was about to take place. Sergeant Major, he said quietly, mind if I ask what load you're shooting? Maggie glanced up with a slight smile. 175 grain Sierra Match King, 44.5 grains of IMR 4064, Federal Primer, once fired Winchester brass, chronographed at 2,650 feet per second. Thompson nodded approvingly. Classic precision load. What's your drop compensation at 1,000? 38.2 minutes of angle adjusted for current conditions, she replied without hesitation. You calculated that by hand? Mental calculation, verified by the calculator. Maggie tapped the small device beside her. But I learned to shoot before computers, so I always double-check the math myself. Thompson whistled softly. Most guys need 3 different apps and still get it wrong. Mind if I watch your process? Not at all, Doctor. Though I should warn you, my methods might seem old-fashioned. The best methods usually are, Thompson replied. As Maggie continued her preparations, Detective Morrison was holding court at the adjacent shooting position. His rifle was a state-of-the-art precision weapon bristling with modern accessories. An adjustable stock, electronic ballistic computer, laser rangefinder, and a scope that cost more than many people's cars. See, this is the difference between then and now, Morrison explained to his audience, running his hand along his rifle's sleek profile. This computer does all the calculations automatically. I just input the target distance, and it tells me exactly where to aim. No guesswork, no margin for error. One of the younger officers in his audience was clearly impressed. How much did that whole setup cost? About 15 grand for the rifle and optics, Morrison replied proudly. But when your life depends on making the shot, you don't cheap out on equipment. He glanced over at Maggie's comparatively simple rifle setup and shook his head. Some people still think they can get by with basic equipment and hope for the best. That's fine for hobby shooting, but this is a serious competition. Dr. Thompson overheard the comment and couldn't resist responding. Actually, Detective, Sergeant Major Chen's rifle represents one of the most sophisticated approaches to precision shooting. She built that weapon specifically for her physical characteristics and shooting style. Everything from the trigger pull weight to the stock dimensions has been customized for optimal performance. Morrison laughed. Doc, with all due respect, that thing looks like it belongs in a museum. My computer can compensate for variables she probably never even heard of. Such as Coriolis effect, for starters, Magnus force, spin drift, atmospheric density variations. Morrison rattled off the terms with obvious pride in his technical knowledge. Interesting, Thompson replied mildly. Sergeant Major, how do you handle Coriolis effect at 1,000 yards? Maggie looked up from adjusting her shooting sling. At this latitude, shooting due north, approximately 0.3 minutes right correction. Negligible for this shot, but I account for it anyway. Morrison's expression changed slightly. Lucky guess. What about spin drift? Thompson continued. 0.8 minutes right for this barrel twist rate and velocity, Maggie answered without hesitation. Magnus force? Depends on wind angle and bullet stability, but typically minimal with proper hand-loaded ammunition. Morrison's confident demeanor was beginning to crack. Anyone can memorize numbers, Doc. The real test is applying them under pressure. You're absolutely right, Thompson agreed. Which is why practical experience matters as much as theoretical knowledge. The range officer approached both shooters with a tablet displaying wind readings and other environmental data. Okay, folks, it's time to get this match started. Current conditions: wind averaging 12 miles per hour from the southwest, gusting to 18. Temperature 78 degrees, humidity 32%, barometric pressure 30-15 inches. Morrison immediately began inputting data into his ballistic computer, frowning as he worked through multiple screens and menus. The device beeped and chirped as it processed the information, eventually displaying a precise aiming point correction. Maggie simply glanced at her wrist, where a small weather meter provided current atmospheric readings, then made minor adjustments to her scope's turrets based on her mental calculations. Ladies and gentlemen, the range officer announced to the gathered crowd, we have an official challenge match at 1,000 yards. Both shooters will fire 5 rounds for score, with the highest total winning. Detective Morrison has won the coin toss and will shoot first. Morrison strutted to the firing line, clearly energized by the audience and confident in his technological advantages. His rifle was mounted on a sophisticated bipod with precision adjustments, and he wore a shooting jacket covered in patches from various competitions and training courses. He settled behind his weapon and began his shooting sequence, periodically checking his ballistic computer and making tiny adjustments to his scope settings. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he prepared for his first shot. "Taking wind from 7 o'clock at 15 miles per hour, Morrison announced, apparently feeling the need to demonstrate his expertise to the audience. His first shot rang out across the desert, and all eyes turned to the electronic target system. "Hit! Scoring a 9, the range officer called out. 0.8 inches left of center. Morrison frowned and checked his computer again. "Wind must have shifted," he muttered, making additional adjustments before firing his second shot. "Hit! Scoring a 10. Dead center." The crowd murmured approvingly. Morrison's confidence returned as he fired his remaining 3 shots in quick succession, each one striking the target in the scoring rings. Detective Morrison's final score, 47 points out of a possible 50, the range officer announced. "That's excellent shooting under challenging conditions." Morrison stood and acknowledged the applause with obvious satisfaction. "Not bad for an afternoon's work," he said, loud enough for Maggie to hear. "Let's see if experience can match modern technique." Maggie rose from her preparation area and walked calmly to the firing line. Unlike Morrison's high-tech setup, her shooting position appeared almost primitive in its simplicity. A basic bipod, a standard shooting sling, and no electronic aids beyond her watch and ballistic calculator. Dr. Thompson positioned himself where he could observe her technique closely. As a former military sniper himself, he understood the subtle elements that separated truly exceptional shooters from merely good ones. Maggie began by studying the terrain between her position and the target, noting how the desert heat created mirage effects that could reveal wind conditions invisible to casual observation. She watched the movement of vegetation at various distances, building a mental map of wind patterns across the entire 1,000-yard range. "Taking forever," Morrison commented to his supporters. "In a real situation, the target would be long gone." Agent Rodriguez shot him a warning look. "In a real situation, taking time to read conditions properly is the difference between mission success and failure." "Easy to say when you're not the one pulling the trigger under pressure," Morrison replied. Maggie adjusted her shooting sling with practiced efficiency, creating a stable platform that would support her rifle while allowing natural point of aim. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action performed with the muscle memory of thousands of repetitions. She settled behind her rifle and began her final preparations. Unlike Morrison's constant adjustments and computer consultations, Maggie's approach was methodical and quiet. She made small corrections to her scope settings, checked her shooting position one final time, then began controlling her breathing. The crowd fell silent as she prepared to fire. Even Morrison stopped talking, his attention focused on the woman whose shooting was about to validate or destroy his assumptions about age and ability. Maggie's first shot seemed to surprise even her with its sudden execution. One moment she was perfectly still behind the rifle, the next moment the weapon had fired and was settling back into position. The electronic target system processed the impact data. "Hit, scoring a perfect 10, the range officer announced. "Dead center." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he maintained his confident expression. Maggie's second shot followed within 30 seconds, fired with the same smooth technique. "Hit, scoring a 10, 1/4 inch from center." Now the crowd was paying serious attention. 2 perfect shots at 1,000 yards under windy conditions was impressive by any standard. "She's on fire," someone whispered. "Lucky shots," Morrison muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Maggie's third shot rang out. "Hit, scoring a 10, dead center." The gathering had grown larger, with competitors and staff members drawn by word of the exceptional shooting taking place at Range 7. Even maintenance workers had abandoned their duties to witness what was becoming a legendary performance. Dr. Thompson leaned closer to observe Maggie's technique. He had trained thousands of shooters during his military career, but he rarely saw such fundamental perfection combined with obvious experience. Every aspect of her shooting process was textbook correct, yet executed with the efficiency that only came from decades of practice. "Fourth shot," the range officer called out as Maggie settled behind her rifle again. This time she paused longer than before, studying the mirage patterns downrange with intense concentration. A subtle wind shift had occurred, and she was adapting her aiming point to compensate. Her fourth shot seemed to hang in the air forever, though in reality the bullet's flight time was barely 2 seconds. Hit. Scoring a 10. 1/8 inch from center. The crowd was now completely silent, mesmerized by the display of marksmanship they were witnessing. Morrison had stopped making dismissive comments, his full attention focused on the impossible shooting performance taking place just yards away from his own position. Maggie ejected the spent cartridge and loaded her final round. The score was 40 points out of 40, 4 perfect 10s at 1,000 yards. One more 10 would give her a perfect score of 50, something that happened perhaps once or twice per year at even the highest levels of competition. But more than the numerical score was at stake. Everyone present understood that this final shot would determine not just the winner of a casual challenge match, but would validate or destroy decades of assumptions about age, experience, and the relationship between technology and skill. Maggie settled behind her rifle one final time, aware of the pressure, but not intimidated by it. She had faced far more consequential shots during her military career, in circumstances where missing meant the difference between life and death for herself and her fellow soldiers. The wind had increased slightly, requiring one final adjustment to her scope settings. She made the correction with the same calm precision she had displayed throughout the entire match, then began her final shooting sequence. Her breathing slowed to a steady rhythm. Her heart rate settled into the controlled pattern that had become second nature during 37 years of military service. The rifle seemed to become an extension of her body, responding to minute adjustments with mechanical precision. The desert around them fell completely silent, as if nature itself was waiting for the outcome of this extraordinary contest between youth and experience, between technology and tradition, between arrogance and quiet competence. Maggie's finger found the trigger and began applying steady pressure, increasing gradually as she had done thousands of times before. In a few seconds, everyone present would learn whether decades of dedication and practice could triumph over modern technology and youthful confidence. The final shot was about to be fired, and no one in the gathered crowd dared to breathe. The moment stretched like taffy in the desert heat. Maggie Chen lay perfectly still behind her rifle, her breathing controlled and rhythmic, her finger applying steady pressure to the trigger. Around her, 50 people held their collective breath, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete buildings and disappeared into the vast Arizona desert. The bullet began its 2-second journey toward a target that appeared no larger than a postage stamp at 1,000 yards, traveling through shifting air currents and heat mirages that could deflect even a perfectly aimed shot. For what seemed like an eternity, no one moved. The electronic target system processed the impact data, its sensors measuring the bullet's exact point of impact down to fractions of an inch. The range officer stared at his tablet screen, then looked up with an expression of disbelief. "Hit," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder. "Scoring a 10. Exact center, dead perfect center." The silence that followed was deafening. 50 points out of 50 possible. 5 perfect shots at 1,000 yards under challenging wind conditions with equipment that some had dismissed as outdated. It was a feat that even professional instructors might achieve only once or twice in their entire careers. Dr. Thompson was the first to break the spell. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, then caught himself. "Sorry, ma'am, but that was incredible. In 30 years of teaching precision shooting, I've never seen anything like that." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, the kind of genuine appreciation that transcends competition and recognizes pure artistry. Even Morrison's supporters found themselves clapping, their earlier dismissiveness forgotten in the face of undeniable excellence. Morrison himself stood frozen at his shooting position, staring at the target display as if he could somehow change the results through sheer force of will. His high-tech rifle suddenly seemed heavy and awkward in his hands, its electronic aids appearing more like crutches than advantages. Maggie rose from her shooting position with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the match. She cleared her rifle, packed her ammunition, and began securing her equipment as if what had just occurred was merely routine. "Ma'am," the range officer said, approaching her with obvious reverence, "I need to ask you to verify this score. 5 10s at 1,000 yards is, well, it's going to be a facility record. I've been here 12 years and I've never seen a perfect score at this distance." "The electronic system is quite reliable," Maggie replied modestly. "I'm confident in your equipment. Still, for the official record, would you mind if we physically inspect the target? This is going to be talked about for years." Maggie nodded her consent, and the range officer dispatched a golf cart to retrieve the target. As they waited, the crowd began to disperse slightly, though most people lingered to continue discussing what they had witnessed. Agent Rodriguez approached Maggie with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Okay, I have to ask, how? I mean, I'm a decent shooter myself, trained by some of the best instructors in the FBI, but what you just did, that's not normal human capability." Maggie smiled at the question. "Sarah, there's nothing superhuman about it. It's simply the result of consistent practice and attention to detail over many years." "Many years," Dr. Thompson interjected, "doesn't begin to cover it. Sergeant Major, would you mind if I asked about your background, I mean, your complete background?" Maggie hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but Agent Mills encouraged her. "Please, I think everyone here would like to understand how someone develops that level of skill." "Very well," Maggie said, settling onto a nearby bench. "I enlisted in the Army in 1986 when I was 18 years old. Like most soldiers, I received basic marksmanship training, but I showed unusual aptitude for precision shooting." She paused as the golf cart returned with her target. The range officer held it up for everyone to see, and a collective gasp arose from the crowd. All 5 bullet holes clustered in the center ring, with the final shot passing directly through the exact center of the 10 ring. "That's a group size of approximately 1/4 inch at 1,000 yards, Dr. Thompson calculated aloud. That's quarter-minute accuracy at extreme range." Maggie acknowledged the comment with a nod and continued her story. "In 1990, I was selected for the Army's Special Operations Command and assigned to a sniper unit. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Somalia, and several classified operations I cannot discuss." The crowd had grown silent again, but for different reasons now. They were beginning to understand that they weren't simply listening to a competition shooter, but to someone whose skills had been tested in the most consequential circumstances imaginable. "During my deployments, I was credited with 187 confirmed eliminations at ranges from 300 to 1,147 yards. The longest shot was taken in Afghanistan in 2003 using a .338 Lapua Magnum rifle at a target that represented an immediate threat to American forces." Morrison, who had been silent since the match ended, finally spoke up. 1,847 yards? That's over a mile." 1,847 yards is exactly 1.05 miles, yes, Maggie confirmed. "The shot required careful calculation of ballistic drop, wind compensation, and atmospheric conditions. It took 3 hours of observation and preparation before I was confident of success. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. 3 hours in a combat situation? The target was a sniper who had been harassing our forward operating base for 2 weeks. He had killed 4 American soldiers and wounded 11 others. Standard protocol would have been to call in artillery or air support, but his position was in a village with significant civilian population. A precision shot was the only option that would eliminate the threat without collateral damage. Dr. Thompson shook his head slowly. A mile-plus shot in combat conditions, with civilian lives at stake. The pressure alone would destroy most shooters' ability to perform. Pressure is simply another environmental factor to account for, Maggie replied, like wind or temperature. You acknowledge it, compensate for it, and execute your fundamentals. She stood and shouldered her rifle case, clearly indicating that she considered the conversation finished. But Detective Morrison wasn't ready to let her leave. Wait a minute, he called out, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. I still don't understand how you made those shots with basic equipment. My computer calculated the exact same ballistic data, but my shooting wasn't nearly as precise. Maggie studied him for a moment, then set down her rifle case. Detective, may I see your rifle? Morrison handed over his weapon, which Maggie examined with professional interest. She worked the bolt, tested the trigger, and examined the scope mounting system. This is an excellent rifle, she said finally. Very well made, with high-quality components. Your ballistic computer is state-of-the-art, and your scope is first-rate. Then why? Because, Maggie interrupted gently, shooting precision rifles isn't about the equipment. Equipment is important, but it's only the foundation. The building that sits on that foundation is skill, developed through thousands of hours of practice under varying conditions. She handed the rifle back to him. Your computer told you exactly where to aim, but it couldn't control your trigger press, your breathing, your natural point of aim, or your mental state. Those elements require human skill, developed through experience. Morrison looked down at his rifle with new understanding. So the technology is a tool, Maggie explained. A very good tool when used properly. But tools don't replace skill. They enhance it. Dr. Thompson stepped forward. Sergeant Major, if I may ask, what were you doing between military retirement and this competition? Because your shooting today suggests you've been maintaining your skills at a very high level. I work part-time as a contractor for various law enforcement agencies, Maggie replied, training snipers, developing curriculum, consulting on difficult shots. I also teach civilian precision rifle courses at my ranch in New Mexico. Ranch courses? Agent Mills asked with obvious interest. I have a 1,000-acre property with shooting ranges from 100 to 1,500 yards. Students come from around the world to learn long-range shooting techniques. The waiting list is currently about 18 months. Morrison's expression had completely changed from arrogance to something approaching humility. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier, the way I acted, that was completely out of line. Detective Morrison, apology accepted, Maggie replied graciously. But let me ask you something. Why do you think you reacted the way you did when you first saw me? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I guess I made assumptions. About your age, your abilities, your relevance to modern shooting. And why do you think you made those assumptions? The question hung in the air as Morrison struggled with an honest answer. Finally, he said, Because I've been taught that newer is always better, that technology replaces experience, that youth beats age. Those aren't unreasonable beliefs, Maggie acknowledged. In many fields, they're often true. But in precision shooting, the fundamentals haven't changed in a century. Breathing, trigger control, sight alignment, follow-through, these skills must be developed through practice, not purchased with technology. Agent Rodriguez joined the conversation. But surely modern equipment helps? Absolutely, Maggie agreed. Better scopes, improved ammunition, more accurate rifles, all of these things extend our capabilities, but they amplify skill. They don't replace it. Give a poor shooter the best equipment in the world, and he'll still be a poor shooter. Give an expert shooter basic equipment, and he'll still outperform the amateur with high-tech gear. The facility's director, attracted by the crowd that had gathered around Range 7, approached the group. "Excuse me, folks, but I understand we had some exceptional shooting here today." Dr. Thompson handed him the target. "Bill, meet Sergeant Major Margaret Chen, retired U.S. Army. She just shot a perfect 50 at 1,000 yards. The director examined the target with growing amazement. This is incredible. Ma'am, would you be interested in giving a demonstration clinic? We have corporate groups and law enforcement agencies that train here regularly. I think they'd benefit enormously from observing your techniques." "I appreciate the offer," Maggie replied, "but I have classes scheduled at my ranch for the next several months." Of course. But perhaps in the future?" As the crowd began to disperse, Detective Morrison approached Maggie one final time. "Ma'am, you mentioned that you teach civilian courses. Would you consider taking on a student who needs to learn some humility along with shooting skills?" Maggie smiled at the question. "Detective, anyone willing to admit they have something to learn is already halfway to becoming a good student. Send me your contact information through the facility office and we'll arrange something." Agent Rodriguez also lingered after most of the crowd had departed. "Maggie, can I ask you one more question? In all your years of shooting, all those combat deployments and competitions, what's the most important lesson you've learned?" Maggie shouldered her rifle case and looked out across the desert toward the distant mountains. "Sarah, I've learned that every shot teaches you something if you pay attention. Success teaches you confidence, but failure teaches you humility and forces you to examine your fundamentals." She paused, then continued. "I've also learned that assumptions about people based on their appearance, age, or background are often wrong. The most dangerous opponents are usually the ones you underestimate." "Like Detective Morrison did today?" "Like Detective Morrison did today," Maggie agreed. But to his credit, he acknowledged his mistake and asked to learn from it. That takes more courage than making the mistake in the first place. As Maggie walked toward her truck in the parking lot, she reflected on the day's events. She had faced similar skepticism throughout her military career, particularly during her early years when female soldiers in combat roles were rare and often unwelcome. She had learned that the most effective response to prejudice was not argument or anger, but simply competent performance that spoke for itself. Loading her equipment into the truck, she thought about the students waiting for her back in New Mexico. Many of them would arrive with the same assumptions that Detective Morrison had displayed, that modern equipment and youthful enthusiasm could substitute for experience and dedicated practice. Her job, as she saw it, was not to destroy their confidence, but to redirect it toward productive learning. The best shooters combined modern technology with traditional fundamentals, understanding that equipment enhanced skill but could never replace it. As she drove through the desert toward home, Maggie smiled at the memory of the afternoon's events. In a few hours, the story of her perfect score would begin spreading through the law enforcement and military shooting community. By tomorrow, it would be shared on social media and discussed in gun shops and training facilities across the country. Some people would focus on the technical aspects of her shooting, analyzing her equipment choices and technique. Others would emphasize the social elements, discussing age discrimination and the importance of not judging people by their appearance. But Maggie hoped that the real lesson would be simpler and more fundamental, that excellence in any field requires dedication, practice, and respect for proven principles. These values transcended age, gender, and technology, remaining as relevant today as they had been when she first picked up a rifle 37 years ago. The highway stretched ahead through the desert landscape, leading back to her ranch where tomorrow's students would arrive ready to learn the same timeless lessons that had guided her extraordinary career. Some would listen carefully and develop into exceptional shooters. Others would struggle with the discipline required for true precision. But all of them would have the opportunity to learn that real expertise wasn't about having the newest equipment or the most impressive credentials. It was about understanding fundamentals, practicing consistently, and maintaining the humility to keep learning throughout a lifetime of shooting. As the sun set behind her, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret Chen drove home satisfied that she had done her part to preserve and pass on the traditions that had shaped her into one of the finest precision shooters of her generation. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that true marksmanship remained an art form that transcended age, technology, and assumptions. The ancient had indeed spoken, with precision, grace, and the quiet authority that comes only from a lifetime of dedication to excellence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just marksmanship skills, but the assumptions and prejudices that had colored the entire day. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, creating challenging lighting conditions for the final stage, everyone present understood that they were about to witness something memorable. What none of them realized was that Maggie Chen had been preparing for this moment not just today, but for her entire adult life.